They tell you the first thing a guardsman learns is how to stand. That is wrong. The first thing you learn is how to disappear while standing in plain sight. I had been at my post in the Vesper Hall of Whitcomb Palace for 2 hours and 11 minutes when the man who would ruin his own evening first looked at me. And in all that time, not one of the 400 guests had truly seen me. That is the work. A man in a red tunic and a tall black bearskin, white gloves crossed at the small of his back, chin level, eyes fixed on a point above the heads of the crowd, becomes part of the room the way the gilding becomes part of the room. You are furniture that breathes. You are the painted edge of a door. Lords brushed past me with their wine. A child wandered close enough to touch the toe of my boot, stared up the length of me as if I were a chimney, and was led away by a nurse who did not so much as nod. None of it reached me. None of it was permitted to. Behind that unmoving face, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking, because I remember every minute of that night the way you remember the night a thing you had buried climbs back out of the ground and stands in the light. I was thinking about the heat. It was high summer in Corville, and the Vesper Hall holds heat the way a kiln holds it. The great windows that run the western wall had been thrown open to the dusk, but the air that came in was the warm, still air of a long day giving up its warmth slowly, and it carried the smell of cut grass from the south lawns and, fainter, of the river beyond the wall. 800 candles burned in the chandeliers and in the standing branches along the columns, and every one of them gave its small portion of fire to the room. The wool of my tunic is good wool, dense and close, made to keep a man warm on a frozen forecourt in the dead of winter. In summer, at a reception under 800 candles, it is a punishment you are not allowed to acknowledge. Sweat ran down the channel of my spine and gathered at my belt, and I did not move. A drop slid from under the band of the bearskin, traced the line of my cheek, and hung at my jaw. I let it hang. To wipe it would have been to admit I was a man. The whole craft of the post is to refuse to admit you are a man until the one moment the kingdom needs you to be one. So I disappeared and I watched, because disappearing is not the same as being absent. A guardsman who truly goes blank is no use to anyone. You hold still and you let your eyes do the only traveling permitted to them. A slow, unhurried sweep that no one notices because your head never turns. I knew where the king sat, on the low dais at the hall's far end, in conversation with the old marshal of the northern approaches. I knew the 2 equerries near the dais and the way they stood, and I knew the understeward by the service door who kept lifting his watch toward the candlelight as though willing the hour to move faster. I knew the cluster of foreign merchants near the cold tables, and the widow of a shipping house who had not stopped talking since she arrived, and the young officer of the household lancers by the 3rd window who had drunk 1 glass more than he should have, and was beginning to laugh at things that were not funny. I knew the room the way I had been trained to know a room, not as a picture, but as a set of weights and intentions, any one of which might shift. And I knew the man at the center of the largest knot of guests, because a man like that arranges the room so that you cannot help but know him. His name was Roland Vask, and by the summer of that year there was scarcely a person in Corville who did not know it, because he had spent a great deal of money making sure of it. He had come up out of the southern ports, a contractor first in cargo and then in men, and over 15 years he had built a private security house, Vantor Strategic, they called it, into something that the kingdom's smaller wars had been quietly leaning on for the better part of a decade. He supplied men where the crown did not wish to spend its own. He guarded the long border roads and the mine concessions, and the embassies in places the regular army would have found awkward to occupy. And he had grown, in the way such men grow, from useful to the kind of powerful that begins to mistake itself for entitled. That evening he was the reason for the gathering, though the gathering pretended otherwise. The crown was weighing whether to hand Vantor Strategic the contract for the outer security of the royal residences, the gate posts, the perimeters, the long patrol lines that the household regiments had held since before any of us were born. It would have been the largest such contract the kingdom had ever signed with a private house, and Vask had not come to be considered. He had come to be confirmed. You could see it in the way he stood. A big man, well-made, going to wait in the way that prosperity carries a man, in a coat that cost more than a guardsman earns in a year, with the easy spread-legged stance of someone who has never in his adult life had to wonder whether a room would make space for him. He laughed often and loudly, and the men around him laughed when he laughed, and the women near him smiled the careful smiles of people who have decided in advance to be charmed. I watched him work the room for an hour without him knowing I watched, and I will say this for Roland Vask, he was not a fool. A fool is easy. He had a memory for names and faces. He flattered the old men about their old victories and the young ones about their prospects, and he had the trick of seeming to confide in a stranger so that the stranger walked away feeling chosen. He was, in the narrow sense, good at the thing he was doing. The trouble with him was not that he was stupid. The trouble was that somewhere on the long climb out of the ports he had decided that the only kind of strength that counted was the kind that could be bought, and that anything which could not be bought that stood there, in the corner, in a red coat, for honor and for the king and for no wage worth nomming, was not strength at all. It was decoration. And Roland Vask had a great contempt for decoration, because decoration was the one thing his money could not become. He found me at 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had given no sign. That is what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. I had not glanced at him, had not stiffened, had not done one single thing to draw the eye of a man whose whole gift was for finding the eye that could be turned. He found me the way a certain kind of man always eventually finds the still figure in the corner, because a room full of people fawning over you grows boring, and the boredom looks around for something to push against, and there in the corner is the one thing in the hall that will not push back. "Now there," I heard him say, and his voice carried because he meant it to, "there is the crown's idea of security." The knot of guests around him turned to look where he was looking. He was looking at me. He raised his glass in my direction the way you might gesture at a painting you intend to disparage. "Look at him," Vask said. "Have you ever seen a finer piece of furniture? They polish him, they wind him up, they set him in the corner, and there he stands. A toy soldier. 40 pounds of bearskin and a rifle he has never fired in anger, guarding the King of Corval against the terrible threat of what? A draft from the window." The men around him laughed. Not all of them. I saw an older guest, a man with the bearing of someone who had served, look down into his glass and not laugh. But most of them laughed, because Vask was the center of the room and the room had decided in advance to enjoy him. The young lancer by the third window laughed loudest of all, which I marked, because a man laughs loudest at the joke he is most afraid is about him. I did not move. I want to be precise about what that costs, because people who have never done it imagine it is nothing, that a man either has the temperament for it or he does not, that standing still is the easiest thing in the world. It is not. To stand still while a powerful man holds you up before a hall of laughing strangers as a thing, not a man, a thing, is a labor of the whole body. Every animal nerve you own is built to answer that. Your face wants to set. Your breath wants to change. Your eyes want, more than anything in the world, to drop 2 inches and find his and let him see that you have heard. The training is the long unteaching of every one of those answers, until the body learns to take the blow and pass it down through itself into the floor, the way a tower takes a wind. The wind howls. The tower stands. The standing is the answer. So I stood, eyes forward, on my point above the crowd. And I let Roland Vask's contempt blow through me and into the marble, and I gave him nothing, and I will not pretend the nothing was easy. It would have ended there, I think, if I had been a worse soldier. If I had so much as tightened my jaw, he would have had his small victory and moved on, the way that kind of man moves on, satisfied to have made the statue twitch. But I gave him nothing, and that, the giving of nothing, is the one thing a man like Vask cannot abide. He had spent his whole life learning to find the lever in every man and pull it, and here was a man with no lever he could see, and instead of recognizing what that meant, He took it as a challenge. "Watch this," he said to his court. "Watch, I'll wager any of you he flinches." He set down his glass on the tray of a passing footman without looking at the footman, and he came across the floor toward me. I had time to take his measure as he came, the way you take the measure of a man crossing open ground toward you, and the old part of me, the part I had spent 11 years and a great deal of effort burying, woke up and did its work without my asking. Big through the chest and shoulders, carried his weight forward, a heavy ring on the right hand. Drink in him, but not enough to slow him, the loose confidence of a man who has been in scuffles and won them by mass, and never once met anyone who knew how to take that mass away from him. He moved like a man who had never been truly afraid, and so had never learned the small economies of a man who has. I noted it the way you note the weather. It told me nothing I needed and everything about him. He stopped a single pace from me, close enough that I could smell the wine and the oil he wore in his hair, and he looked up into my face, for I am a tall man, and the bearskin makes a tall man into a giant, and he had to look up, which I think annoyed him. "Hello in there," he said. He waved a hand slowly in front of my eyes, the gesture you make at a man you suspect of being asleep with his eyes open. "Anyone home, or did they hollow you out and stuff you?" The hall had gone quieter. Not silent. 400 people do not fall silent for one rich man's joke. But the not near us had drawn closer, and the quiet was spreading out from them in a ring, the way it does when a crowd senses that something is being done that it is not quite comfortable watching but cannot make itself look away from. I held my point above his head. To do that I had to look, in a sense, through him, and there is a particular discipline to looking through a man who is standing close enough to touch you and wants very much to be looked at. I gave him the through look. I have given it to better men than him. "Extraordinary," Vask said to the room, not to me. "I've seen better life in a coat rack." And then, because the room had not laughed enough, because the statue had not cracked, he did the thing that I think he had been working himself toward since the moment he picked me out of the corner. He reached up with one thick finger, and he flicked the brass clasp of my chin strap, the small fitting that holds the bearskin's weight under the jaw, and he flicked it hard enough that the strap bit for an instant into the skin of my throat. There is a line in this work, and most men never test it because most men are not so far gone in their own importance that they forget it exists. The line is the uniform. A guardsman is the king's man, in the king's cloth on the king's ground, and to lay a hand on him is not the same as laying a hand on a stranger at a tavern. It is, in the old and exact sense, an offense against the crown. Roland Vask did not know that, or did not care, or, and I think this was the truth of it, knew it perfectly well, and was so certain of his own weight in that room that he believed the rule, like every other rule, could be bought off after the fact with a laugh and a story. The strap bit my throat. I did not move. But I will tell you what happened behind the face, because that is the part no camera in that hall could have caught, the part the footmen and the lords and Roland Vask himself never saw and never would have understood if they had. When the brass bit my throat, I was, for the length of a single breath, no longer in the Vesper Hall. I was at Carrow Ford. It is a thing that happens to men who have done certain work and then walked away from it and learned to be ordinary again. You can go years. You can stand 1,000 posts and watch 1,000 receptions and feel nothing rise. And then a small thing, a smell, a sound, the bite of a strap against the throat in the dark, opens the ground under you and you are back, whole and entire, in the worst night of your life, and it lasts no longer than a heartbeat, and it lasts forever. Carrow Ford is a crossing on the Texel, far in the eastern marches, in a war that the kingdom has mostly chosen to forget because it was small and far away and went badly before it went well. I was a younger man then, and I did not wear red. I wore gray and brown and the mud of the marches, and I belonged to a thing called the Marsh Company, which was the name the army gave to the few dozen of us it sent ahead of everyone else into the places it did not yet hold. We were reconnaissance, which is the polite word. We went into the dark and we found out what was there and we came back. And on the nights when we could not come back quietly, we came back loud. And that was the part the army pretended not to know about. On the night I am speaking of, a relief column of the Crown's engineers and the wounded they were carrying had been cut off on the wrong side of the Texel when the bridge above the ford went down. 40-odd men, half of them hurt, pinned against the river with the high ground behind them, held by people who wanted very much for none of them to see morning. The army that should have gone in for them could not move before dawn. By dawn, there would have been nothing to move for. There were 9 of us at the ford. I was the one they listened to, because by then I had been doing the work longest and had the fewest dead behind me, which is the only seniority that means anything in a place like that. We went across in the dark, through water that came to the chest and ran cold enough to take the breath, and we brought those 40 men out 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 across the ford under fire, and it took the whole of the night. And when the gray came up over the marsh, 7 of us were still standing and the 40 were alive on the right bank, and not one of the engineers, not one of the wounded, had been left in the water. That is the whole of it, told plainly, the way it should be told. There was no glory in it. There was cold water and the weight of hurt men, and the particular labor of carrying a frightened person who does not know you and will not stop fighting you, across a current, in the dark, while the dark fires at you. I have carried a great many things in my life. I have never carried anything heavier than a wounded man who is sure you mean to drown him. The thing the strap brought back, in that single heartbeat in the Vesper Hall, was not the fire. It was a smaller thing. Near the end of that night, hauling the last of the engineers up the far bank, my pack strap had fouled on something in the dark and bitten up under my jaw and half-throttled me. And for one black instant I had been sure I was going into the river with the man on my back, and I had not panicked, because panic is a luxury, and I had got my fingers under the strap and freed it and finished the climb. The bite of the brass at the reception was the bite of that strap. The body does not forget. The body keeps the ledger the mind tries to close. So when Roland Vask flicked my chin strap and bit my throat and stood there grinning, waiting for the toy soldier to twitch, the truth that he could not have begun to guess was this: there was nothing he could do with his soft, beringed finger in that bright safe hall that the marsh had not already done to me 20 years before, in the cold and the dark, with men's lives in the balance. He thought he was testing me. He had no conception of what I had already passed. He was a boy throwing a pebble at a wall that had stood against a flood. I came back into the hall between one breath and the next. No one had seen me leave it. I held my point. The strap settled. The brass cooled where his finger had been. And Vask, getting nothing, did the thing that finally turned the evening, because a man who cannot make a statue flinch will, if you give him long enough, escalate until he is no longer playing. He turned to the room, to the whole room now, for by then the hall had drawn in around us, and even the king on his distant dais had become aware that something was occurring at the western wall, though he could not yet have known what. Vask spread his arms in the manner of a man making a speech he has given before, and intends to enjoy. "This," he said, and his voice filled the Vesper Hall, "is what I have come to talk to His Majesty about. Look at him. A fine figure, a magnificent figure. I would not part with him for 100 crowns as a hat stand. But the gates of this palace, my lords and ladies, the walls of it, the safety of the king's own person, entrusted to men like this. Men who are trained to stand still and be looked at. Trained to do nothing while a stranger walks up and lays hands on them." He laughed. "I could walk a company of my men through these grounds tonight and your toy soldiers would salute us as we passed. They are not security. They are theater. And theater is very fine until the night a real wolf comes to the door." He let that sit. He was good, I will grant him again, at letting a thing sit. "Give me the contract," Vask said, "and I will give you men who have done the work. Not stood for it, done it. Men who have been in the dark places and come back. Men who have earned their decorations on ground that mattered, not on a parade square. I am not asking the crown to gamble. I am asking it to stop gambling, to take the safety of its king out of the hands of—" and here he turned, and he looked back up at me, and he smiled, out of the hands of pretty furniture and put it into the hands of soldiers. I think it was the word soldiers that did it, not the insult which I had already taken and passed into the floor, the word. Because Roland Vask, standing in his expensive coat with the river of the port still somewhere in the back of his throat, had spent the last quarter of an hour making me into the opposite of a soldier, a hollow thing, a co-track, theater, and the truth, the buried and unhandsome truth that I had spent 11 years keeping in the ground where it belonged, was that of every man in that bright and gilded hall, there were perhaps 3 who had done the kind of work Vask was talking about. And 2 of them were old, and the 3rd was the one he was calling furniture. Still I gave him nothing. Understand, I had no intention even then of speaking. It is not a guardsman's place to defend himself, and it is certainly not his place to brawl with words against a guest of the crown in the crown's own hall. My orders, my training, my whole long discipline told me one thing, and it told me clearly, hold, hold and let it pass. The man would have his moment, and the moment would end, and the hall would forget, and I would go off my post at the change and walk out into the warm dark, and the night air would take the candle heat out of the wool, and none of it would have touched the thing that actually mattered, which was that the 40 men of Carrow Ford had seen morning, and were, most of them, alive somewhere in the kingdom that night. Fathers now, some of them, with children who did not know and would never need to know what their fathers had survived. That was the real thing. Roland Vask's contempt was weather. I had stood in worse weather. So I would have held. I would have let him have it all and walked out into the dark and said nothing, and the story would have ended with a powerful man's joke and a guardsman's silence, which is how 9 of every 10 such stories end, and rightly. But there was a man in that hall who would not let it end so. I had marked him an hour before without knowing why he drew my eye, an old man, spare and upright, with the particular straightness of a back that has been made straight by years, and not by tailoring, standing a little apart from the knots of guests with a glass he was not drinking. He had not laughed when the others laughed. He had watched the whole of it the way I watch a room, which is to say he had been reading it, and somewhere in the reading he had gone very still in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. When Vask said soldiers, the old man set his glass down on the nearest ledge with a small, definite click, and he came forward out of the crowd, and the crowd led him through the way a crowd does for a man who moves as though he has every right to. "Mr. Vask," the old man said. Vask turned, all warmth, ready to fold one more admirer into his court. "Sir," he said, "you'll forgive me, I don't believe we've—" "You don't know me," the old man agreed. "That's quite all right, I know you, or rather I know your firm, Vantor Strategic." He said the name the way you set down something you have decided not to keep. "I read your prospectus, a handsome document, a great many fine words about earned decorations and ground that mattered." He let that hang the way Vask liked to let things hang, and I saw Vask register that the old man was using his own rhythm against him, and not enjoy it. "I was particularly taken," the old man went on, "by the action your prospectus features most prominently, the night crossing, the relief of the cut-off engineers at the Eastern Ford, 40 men brought out of the water under fire by, how does your document phrase it, by Vantor Strategic operatives in the firm's first contracted campaign. It is, I will say, the centerpiece of your reputation. The medal struck for it hangs, I believe, in the entrance of your offices. I have seen the photograph." "It does," Vask said. The warmth had cooled by a degree. "It is the proudest action in the firm's history. 18 of my men crossed that river. We do not let people forget it, no. Why should we?" "No reason at all," the old man said, "if it were true." The hall, which had been quiet, became something past quiet. "I beg your pardon," said Vask. The old man did not raise his voice. That was the thing about him. He had no need to. "I served 31 years in the army of this kingdom," he said. "I retired a general of the Eastern Command. I am, as it happens, the officer who signed the citation for the action at the Eastern Ford, Carrow Ford, to give it the name your prospectus declines to use. And I can tell you, Mr. Vask, with the certainty of a man who held the dispatches in his own hands and walked the ground 3 days after, that on the night those 40 men were brought out of the water, your firm did not exist. Vantor Strategic was incorporated the following spring. Your men crossed nothing that night because there were no men of yours to cross. The men who crossed that ford numbered 9. They wore the gray of the Marsh Company. 7 of them came back. The medal you hang in your entrance hall was struck for them, and the right to it was, through a paperwork I have spent a good part of my retirement being ashamed of, assigned to your firm 2 years later, when your firm bought the contract that absorbed what was left of that company's records. You did not earn that medal, Mr. Vask. You purchased the file it was kept in. You could have heard the candles. You truly could. There is a silence that falls on a great room when something that everyone half suspected, and no one had dared to say, is said plainly by a man with the standing to say it. And it is unlike any other silence, because 400 people are all at once doing the same arithmetic and arriving at the same answer. Vask's face had gone through several things and arrived at the only thing left to it, which was anger. "This is slander," he said. "Whoever you are, in front of the king, you have no—" "I have the citation," the old general said. "I have, I should think, the only living memory in this hall of what the night actually cost. And I will tell you something else I have, Mr. Vask, that you do not, which is the names of the 7 men who came back." He turned then. He turned away from Vask entirely, which was its own kind of dismissal, and he looked across the small open floor that the crowd had made, and he looked at me. I had given no sign. I want that on the record above everything else. From the flick of the strap to that moment I had not moved 1 inch off my post, had not dropped my eyes, had not let one muscle of my face confess that I had heard a single word of any of it. As far as Roland Vask knew, as far as the whole hall knew, I was exactly what he had named me. The furniture in the corner, the toy soldier, the breathing edge of the door. The general looked at me, and his old face did a thing I had not seen on it all evening. It softened, and underneath the softness was something that took the strength out of my knees in a way that Roland Vask's whole performance had not come close to doing. Because I knew that face. I had not placed it across the long, bright hall, in the candlelight, in the dress coat, with 20 years laid over it, but at 3 paces, looking at me the way he was looking at me, I knew it. He had been a younger man at Carrow Ford too, though not so young as I, and he had stood on the right bank in the gray of the morning and counted us up out of the water. The 7 of us, and he had been the one who took down our names while we shook too hard to write our own. "Sergeant," the general said. He said it quietly, he said it to me. And here is the place where my whole long discipline and the entire weight of my orders came up against the one thing they could not answer. Because there is no instruction in any manual ever written for a guardsman that tells him what to do when a general of the Eastern Command, in the Vesper Hall of Whitcomb Palace, in the hearing of the king, looks at the furniture in the corner and calls it by the rank it earned in the cold water of the marches 20 years gone. I will tell you what I did. I have thought about it many times since, and I am not certain to this day whether it was the right thing or only the human thing, but I know it was the only thing my body would consent to do. I came to attention. Not the parade attention I had been holding all night. That is a held posture, a maintained stillness, a thing you build and keep. This was the other one, the older one, the one the body learns first and never truly forgets. The sharp, whole, sudden answer of a soldier to his commanding officer, the heels coming together, the spine finding its true vertical, the eyes, and this was the part I could not have stopped if my life had hung on it. The eyes coming off the high safe point above the crowd and down, 2 inches, 3, to find the face of the man who had spoken. I looked at him. After 11 years of looking through everyone, I looked at a man and let him see that I had heard. "General Ardent," I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant it. I had not used it for anything but the change of the watch in a long time. "Sir." The hall made a sound. 400 people making the same small, involuntary sound at once, a kind of indrawn breath, because the furniture had spoken, and the general had a name, and the two facts together rearranged everything they thought they had been watching. "Tell them," General Ardent said. He did not take his eyes from me. "I'll not order it, lad. It's not mine to order any more, and it was never the sort of thing one orders. But I am asking you, in front of this man and this king and this hall, to tell them where you crossed that you should be called furniture by the likes of him." I want to be honest about what I felt, standing there, because the easy version of this story would have me feel vindicated, would have me feel the warm rush of a wrong about to be set right, and that is not what I felt. What I felt mostly was tired and exposed, and a kind of grief I had no name for, because the thing I had spent 11 years carefully burying was being lifted out of the ground in front of strangers, and I had not asked for it to be, and once it was out it could never go back in. A man does not bury a thing like Caro Ford because he is ashamed of it. He buries it because it is too heavy to carry in daylight, and the only way to go on and be ordinary, to stand a post, to draw a wage, to be furniture, to be at peace, is to put it in the ground and pile the years on top and walk away. Roland Vasque, with his cheap contempt and his stolen metal, had made the general dig it up. I did not thank either of them for that. I have never thanked them for it. But the general had asked, and there is in some of us a thing older than discipline and older than peace, which is the debt you owe to the men who did not come back, and the 7 of us who came out of that water had made each other a promise without ever saying it aloud, which was that we would not let the night be sold. We would not let it be made into a line in a rich man's prospectus and a medal in a rich man's hall. It was not for sale. It had been paid for in a currency Roland Vasque did not have and could not imagine, and the least I owed the 2 who did not come back, and the least I owed myself, was to say so, once plainly, in the one hall in the kingdom where the saying might matter. So I told them. I did not make a speech of it. I have no gift for speeches, and the work does not deserve to be dressed up. I told them about the bridge going down and the 40 men pinned against the river, and the 9 of us, and the water that took the breath out of you, and the carrying. I did not name the dark fires or make it grand. I told them it took the whole of the night, and that 7 of us were standing at the gray, and that not one of the 40 was left in the water. I told them I had been the one the rest listened to, and that the general standing before them had counted us up out of the river at dawn and written down our names, because our hands were shaking too hard to write them ourselves. And I told them because it was true, and because Roland Vasque was still standing there and I wanted it said to his face, that I had worn gray then, and that I wore red now, and that the men of this regiment and the men I had served with in the marches were the same men in 2 different coats, and that any one of them on any night would stand at any door in this kingdom and not move while a frightened person hid behind them, and would go into any water for 40 strangers, and would never once ask to be thanked for it, and would certainly never sell it. When I finished there was no applause. I am glad of that looking back. Applause would have made it into theater, which was the one thing Roland Vasque had accused us of, and the one thing it was not. There was only the silence and the candles and 400 people looking at the furniture in the corner and seeing, for the first time all evening, a man. The general turned back to Vasque then. He did it slowly, and there was no triumph in it, which made it worse for Vasque than any triumph would have been. "You came here tonight," Ardent said, "to tell the king that his guard is theater and your men are soldiers. You stood in front of a man who carried 40 strangers out of a river under fire, and you flicked his collar and called him furniture, because you could not feel the difference between a man who has done the work and a man who has bought the file. That, Mr. Vasque, is precisely why the crown should never hand you its walls. Not because your men can't fight, I'm sure some of them can, but because you do not know what you are looking at. A man who cannot tell the genuine article from a thing he has purchased will, on the night the real wolf comes to the door, be looking at the wrong thing entirely." It was at this point that the king rose. I had not dared look toward the dais, but I felt the room turn, the way you feel a tide change, and I knew before I heard the rustle of 400 people coming to their feet what it meant. The King of Corval is not a young man and does not move quickly, and he crossed the length of the Vesper Hall slowly, with the Marshal of the Northern approaches a pace behind him, and the crowd opened before him and closed behind him, and he came to a stop in the small open floor where the general stood, and where Roland Vask stood, and where I stood at attention with my eyes now respectfully lowered because a soldier does not stare at his king. He looked at Vask for a moment. He did not say very much to Vask. He did not need to, and I think he understood, as the general had, that the most complete humbling you can deal a man like that is not to rage at him, but to make him small by simply turning past him to the thing that matters. So the king looked at Vask for a moment, long enough for Vask to understand that whatever he had come for that evening, he would not be leaving with it, and then the king turned to me. "Sergeant," he said, he used the rank too. They had decided between them, the old general and the old king, that I would wear it again for the length of that evening whether I wished to or not. "Is it true, what you've told us, all of it?" "Yes, your majesty," I said. "And you have stood at my gates," the king said, "and in my halls for how long?" 11 years, your majesty." 11 years, the king said, "and in 11 years you never thought to mention it." "It was not mine to mention, your majesty," I said, "and it is not the sort of thing a man mentions. It belongs to the men who were there. I only carried part of it." The king was quiet for a moment. He was an old man, and he had seen, in his long reign, a great many men come into his halls wanting things, and I think he had grown very good at the difference between the men who wanted and the men who did not, and I think the difference was, to a king, a restful thing to find. "No," he said at last. "No, you carried the part that mattered." He looked then around the hall at the 400 risen guests, and at Roland Vask standing alone now in the cleared floor with no court left around him, for a man's court does not stay with him past the moment he is publicly diminished, and they had already, every one of them, begun to drift back into the crowd as if they had never laughed at any joke of his at all. The king raised his voice for the hall, though only a little. A king does not need to raise it much. "We are sometimes asked," the king said, "to mistake what is bought for what is earned, to believe that strength is the thing that can be hired, and that the men who stand at our doors for honor rather than for wage or decoration. We will not be making that mistake. The walls of these residences have been held by the men of the household regiment since before my grandfather's time, and they will go on being held by them, and the contract that brought us all here this evening will not be signed." He let that land. It landed. "I think," the king said, "that our guest has a long road home and should be allowed to begin it." That was all. He did not have Vask thrown out. He did not need to. There is no escort more total than a king saying, mildly, in front of 400 people, that a man has a long road home. Roland Vask stood for one more moment in the cleared floor of the Vesper Hall, a big man, well-made, in a coat that cost more than a guardsman earns in a year. And then whatever it is that holds a man like that upright went out of him, and he made some small noise that was meant to be dignified and was not, and he turned and walked the length of the hall to the great doors, and the crowd did not open for him the way it had opened for the general and the king. It simply failed to be where he was walking, which is a different thing and a worse one. He went out into the summer dark, and the doors closed behind him, and Vantor Strategic, I am told, never recovered the standing it lost in that hall in that quarter of an hour, and within a few years the firm was sold off in pieces, and the metal came down from the entrance wall, and where it went I do not know and do not care, because it was never his, and a thing that is not yours cannot be taken from you twice. I will not pretend the rest of the evening was easy. The general came and gripped my hand and held it a long time and did not say much, because there was not much to say between two men who had stood on the same riverbank at the same gray dawn and counted the same survivors. Some of the guests came, too, the older ones mostly, the ones who had served, and they did not gush. The ones who have done the work never gush, but they came and they stood near me for a moment and let me see that they had heard, and that was its own kind of payment. The young lancer who had laughed loudest came last of all, and he was sober now and ashamed, and he could not get the words out. And I told him quietly that it was all right, that a man laughs loudest at the joke he is most afraid is about him, and that the cure for the fear was not to stop standing posts but to stand enough of them that one day, when his own ford came, he would already know how to cross it. I do not know if he understood me that night. I have heard since that he turned out a good officer, so perhaps he did in time. And then the change of the watch came, as it always comes, and I was relieved, and I marched off my post the way I had marched onto it, eyes forward, heels striking the marble, furniture again, or so the room would have thought if the room had still been watching. And I walked out through the service corridors and out the small east door into the summer dark, and the night air came up off the south lawns and the river beyond the wall and took the candle heat slowly out of the wool, and I stood for a while in the dark by myself, which I had earned, and I let myself, for the first time in 11 years, think about the marsh on purpose, in daylight, or near enough to it. I have turned that evening over a great many times since, and I think the thing Roland Vask never understood, the thing his whole money-built world had unfitted him to understand, is that the entire craft of the post, the standing, the silence, the refusal to be moved, the long unteaching of every animal nerve, is not theater and is not decoration, and is not the absence of a soldier. It is the most demanding thing a soldier can be asked to do, because it is the discipline of strength that chooses, hour after hour, not to be used. Any man with mass and a grievance can strike. It takes nothing. The thing that takes everything is to be the man who could end the matter in a heartbeat, who has crossed the cold water and carried the wounded and knows exactly, in his hands and his bones, what he is capable of, and to stand there and not. To take the flick of the strap and pass it into the floor. To be called furniture by a fool and give the fool nothing, not because you cannot answer, but because the answer is beneath the post and beneath the cloth and beneath the men who did not come back. Roland Vask thought he was testing a toy soldier. He never knew that the stillest thing in that bright hall was the most dangerous one, and that the reason it was safe to stand a single pace from it and flick its collar was the very thing he despised. That the man inside the red coat had spent his whole life learning to hold the thing he carried, and would never, not for a contract and not for a king and not for his own pride, let it off the leash for anything smaller than another night at another ford, another 40 strangers, another stretch of cold water that someone had to cross. He came looking for furniture. He found a man who had already crossed his river. He simply did not have the eyes to know it until it was far, far too late. And I would stand that post again tomorrow, in the heat, in the wool, under 800 candles and disappear, and let them all walk past without seeing me. That is not the failure of the work. That is the work. The kingdom does not need me to be seen. It needs me to be there in the corner in the red coat, holding still, so that on the night the real wolf does come to the door will already be held by a man who has been to the water and back and knows the way.